Welcome to the Saga of Whispering Whale, a novel by Edward J. Zivica, published by Ravens in the Sky Publishing, and read by Mona Lee McCrae for Unified Concepts Media. During the reading of Whispering Whale, when you hear this sound, it indicates that there has been a change in scene or a change in time within the story. Acknowledgements by the author, Edward J. Zivica. First acknowledgement goes to the whale species, always marvelous, always an inspiration, and somehow close by all my life. Second acknowledgement goes to Dr. Jeff Connie, a teacher of graduate fiction writing and screenwriting at Northeastern State University in Oklahoma. After completing Whispering Whale, I was referred to Jeff for his editorial direction. Jeff took me by the hand and showed me what a novel is, his first comment being, "Ed, to start with, get some damn dialogue into this story." After years of work, following his pointing finger and drill sergeant instructions, I have reached a point of satisfaction. Jeff has not only been my educator, he is my good friend. The next acknowledgement goes to Ms. Nancy Gillum, a friend of many years, and the financial provider for the publication of Whispering Whale. She has my deep gratitude for her unfailing belief in the project and allowing the use of her hard-earned money. And lastly, I thank myself. Chapter 1. Voyage to New Atlantis. The all that is, a tiny word encompassing everything. When partitioned, the is yields the spiritual and the physical. This story is concerned with both, and I start with the physical. On the outer edge of a rotating pool of stars, a sphere of nuclear fire spun, and around that heat spun other spheres, one cool and blue, the blue a reflection of seas that dominated its surface. Daily, half the planet bathed in its own shadow, although periodically a moon intruded and paled the darkness with reflected light. In a shadow-cast sea, deep and beyond the penetration of the moon's rays, swam a leviathan. In body and brain, it is the largest creature on the blue planet. Oddly, its ancestors once walked the dry earth, though the species found that situation unsuitable. This aged male, Earth's last whale, suffered the ill health of time. The whale rose toward the surface through a blackened sea. Tiny phosphorescent creatures flashed with the intrusion, illuminating the whale as if a comet in a starless sky. Above, in limpid air, a bright moon gleamed, and the sea's surface loomed as black marble. Nothing indicated the approaching comet. The whale shattered the tranquility with surging water and expelling breath. Shimmering black waves moved toward sea and shore, while the whale maneuvered to observe a nearby land of low hills that in the light of day were green with jungle growth. Near the shore, the sailing craft, Christine, illuminated white by the moon, tugged smoothly at her anchor line. The whale had accompanied the Christine, unknown to its inhabitants, since the start of its voyage, a long voyage that originated far to the north in a colder sea. Motionless, the whale pondered the human's thoughts. His intrusion, nearly imperceptible, swirled in soft colors, charming the leviathan. Satisfied with the situation, the whale submerged. A small wave nudged the craft, and its anchor line groaned. The vessel, 50 feet in length, had a broad beam. Although this girth slowed her speed, it compensated with stability. Within her heavy fiberglass skin, large cabins fore and aft and a cockpit amidship comprised her basic accommodations. Once a pleasure craft, once a pretty lady, time and circumstance had dulled her brilliance. A shortened main mast made her squatty. Patchwork sails, when hoisted, gave her a tattered appearance. Large aluminum chests, lashed to her forward deck, comprised the primary burden under which she labored. Below, more aluminum containers consumed the forward cabin space. Aft of that cabin, a small galley contained a table, 2 sitting benches, and a few storage cabinets, all constructed of rough-cut wood. A small home-made wood-burning stove sat to port, and a supply of firewood to starboard. 2 steps from the stove, a small ladder led topside to the cockpit. Here a bench, again of rough-cut wood, spanned the width of the command space. A stainless steel helm glittered in the moonlight. At the stern a large cabin served as a stateroom. Its interior was broad and had a high overhead. A large, crudely constructed berth, centered beneath an open hatch, allowed moonlight to illuminate the reclining forms of 2 humans. One, a man, his name Justin, strong of body and nearly 50 years of age, slept on his stomach. In deep sleep his breathing was barely perceptible. Next to him lay a woman, Nicole. Awake, her mind murmured with the soothing energy of recent love-making, while the moon appeared blue through her half-closed eyes. Nicole mused on the moments before sundown when she and her lover swam in the warm sea as the sun hovered, huge and red, on the blue-gray horizon. Nicole and Justin stood naked at the stern of the Christine and scanned the calm sea. With spontaneous synchronicity, they dove into the sumptuous waters and were enveloped with tender pressure and absolute smoothness. Nicole swept her arms backward and arched toward the surface, leaving a trail of tiny bubbles escaping from her long black hair. She saw Justin dive beneath her, roll to his side and then to his back. She watched him, watching her. When Nicole surfaced, she ignored Justin, finding interest below. She swam toward land in a series of dives with the relaxed motions of someone having fun. Justin followed, floating on his back when she dove and spinning onto his chest when she surfaced. Soon Nicole and Justin were close enough to shore to touch the sandy bottom with their feet. Their swim became a walk, while the steep slope of the beach produced ebbing waves that tugged vigorously at their legs. Both grinned with inner contentment. Nicole took Justin's hand as they turned to walk the path of wet sand at the sea's edge, toward the half-circle of the setting sun. "I love this part of the day." She turned to face Justin and walked a few steps backwards, looking past him into the eastern sky. "The count log indicates the moon will be at its fullest." She wheeled back to his side. Justin pulled her close. "When we get back to New Atlantis, what say we organize a moon festival?" He squeezed her hand. "Moontime parties. There's a need for more celebration times." Nicole smiled. "I like that." She paused in thought. "We could do it on every blue moon." She yanked the back of his hand to her lips and sucked a kiss. Justin glanced at the Christine before turning to Nicole. "Dancing to the blue moon." Nicole's eyes squinted. "We'll give it a female name, of course." She looked down as a tiny wave washed across her feet. "The moon is female, and so is the night." She turned to Justin. "Diana's moon." Justin tugged her hand. "You're not going to exclude men, are you?" Nicole's eyes twinkled. "Of course not. We'll need a sacrificial something." Justin chuckled. "Eons from now, a new civilization will celebrate the blue moon ceremony. He raised their clasped hands and pointed his thumb in her direction. "And all because of you." Justin abruptly stopped. "Damn. We'll carve the story on a stone and bury it at the cavern." Nicole continued. "And thousands of years from now they'll dig it up." She mockingly lowered her voice into a deep tone. "We have found conclusive evidence to the origin of the Blue Moon celebrations in a place once known as New Atlantis." Justin smiled. "The ancient moon ceremony." He bowed toward Nicole. "Brought to you by Nicole, High Priestess, and Justin, the sacrificial something." Nicole elbowed Justin in the ribs. "It'll be quite the honor to be the first sacrificial something." She paused. "And you'll be listed at the top of the credits, of course." She smiled. "To make it more civilized, we'll just mess you up a little." Justin squeezed her hand. "A bunch of naked women knocking me about." She squeezed his hand. "The old rejected women will be doing the knocking about." Justin looked up into the sky. "Perhaps we should rethink this whole thing." When the sun dipped below the horizon, the couple returned to the blue-black sea and swam to their floating home. They hauled themselves aboard near the stern, where buckets of fresh water waited. They scooped handfuls and basted their skin free of the sea salt. Nicole brushed drops of liquid from Justin's back, pushed his hair aside, and wrapped her arms around him as she planted a kiss on his shoulder. "Time for bed." She kissed him again. "But not for sleep." Justin turned to face her. His dark blue eyes flashed, and he spoke with mock romance. "The night has fallen. The moon is on the rise." He kissed Nicole's smiling lips and spoke through the kiss. "And I give myself willingly as the sacrificial something." These were special moments. In the past their love of necessity was more spiritual than physical. With death perpetually present, few opportunities arose, and the simple act of holding on to one another had to suffice. Now, Nicole and Justin no longer moved in fear. The earth spun with regained stability. Life and death were once again in balance. Nicole blinked, clearing the blue tinge of moon rays. She rolled to her side, kissed Justin's back, and joined him in a comfortable slumber. Hours later, the cabin aft was illuminated with the dim light of a rising sun. Justin awoke and looked through the hatch at the early morning sky. Mornings were his favorite time of the day. Mornings were new beginnings, and Justin loved new beginnings. He rose to a sitting position, swung his legs off the bunk, and his toes touched the cabin deck. Sinewy muscles rippled in reflection of a strenuous lifestyle. He rubbed his clean-shaven face with a calloused hand. The last time he had had a beard was during the wilderness days, before they found their way to New Atlantis. But that was years ago. He fetched his trousers that hung from a peg near the ladder and slipped them on. Next, he sat on the ladder, grabbed his shoes, and fitted them onto his feet. They were homemade shoes, moccasin-like, the only kind now existing. As Justin tied the laces, he gazed at Nicole's sleeping form. He knew every part of her body. In early life, she had pursued the sport of swimming and the art of dance. These activities produced a body that women admired and men noticed. Nicole lay on her stomach, her lengthy hair, the color of onyx, feathered across her back. The hair covered long scars that ran from her shoulders to her buttocks. There were also puncture and tear marks on the left side of her face and at the back of her neck, all reminders of a moment of horror, a moment Justin had witnessed. With a blink of his eyes, Justin vanquished the hideous thoughts. He rose to his feet. 6'2", His lean face made him appear even taller. He glanced at his lover and thought of waking her. Instead, he turned and moved topside. On deck he looked to the east. The sun, half above the horizon, flamed in quivering red, and the sea before it shimmered in deep blue-pink. The sky faded from yellow near the sun to blue directly above. Justin turned to the western horizon, where the last of the night was studded with a few lingering stars. He scanned the sea surface. Near shore, a whale spouted. He searched the shoreline for the location of a small stream. The Christine's fresh water tanks needed replenishing. A task he could do alone, he strode to the stern where a small dinghy, laden with water cans, bobbed at the end of a tether line. Justin pulled the tiny craft alongside, climbed aboard, and pushed it free of the larger vessel. Sitting in the middle seat, his back to the bow, Justin locked the oars in place and made a few strokes toward land. Eyeing the larger vessel as he rowed, he whispered the craft's name. "Christine. Who gave you that name, and why?" He would never know the answer to these questions. Justin had some difficulty when it came to rowing. The ring finger and the little finger of his left hand were missing. A wild dog had bitten them off. However, having a thumb, he maintained his gripping power. Pulling twice on the left oar and once on the right, Justin swiveled the little craft toward land. He watched the Christine as he rowed. It was now more than a year since he had first seen her, long after the time of fire and ice. Then he and Nicole and 9 others from New Atlantis were on an expedition to the northwest coast to retrieve Justin's buried supplies. The long trek required 6 months to complete. Their destination was the mouth of a river once known as the Umpqua. Prior to the bad years, Justin's home sat near the river's mouth. The location was central to the buried chests, now secured aboard the Christine. The 24 chests contained food, tools, clothing, medical equipment, seeds and books, and other things. Because Justin was once a man of cozy wealth, the hidden items were of high quality, well protected, and intended to aid his family in their struggle to survive in a time when death moved faster than life. Justin recalled the re-encounter with the coastal forest. Then only a few mature trees stood tall, but mostly the land was thick with the bright green of a new forest. The soil, soft with mulch, had a musky smell. Ferns seemed to grow everywhere, and clusters of mushrooms dotted the cool, damp terrain. But the river was the true delight. It would lead to yet another love, the ocean. Justin, scouting ahead of the main party, moved with anxious energy. It was early summer, the weather hot, and the river level low. Small stones covered the bank. Justin felt their shape and the sun's embedded heat through his thin-soled moccasins as he watched seals hunt and play in the slow-moving waters. The seals barked at his intrusion and swam away, but Justin smiled. The animals indicated the nearness of the river's mouth. He turned to ascend a small jetty of large stones. With his eyes cast down to find footing, he made his way to the top of the structure. When he looked up, he nearly lost his balance. No more than 30 yards from the tip of his nose, the huge whale-like hull of a boat rested. Justin found his balance with arms extended. The craft lay on a gravel bar on the downstream side of the jetty. With its starboard side up, the bow pointed into the river. Overcoming his astonishment, Justin descended to the beach and ambled over to the derelict. For a few moments he stood before her, quietly thinking. Eventually he touched the hull. Taking long strides, he slid his hand over the vessel's skin. The rubbing act tingled his palm and bristled the hairs on his arm. It was the beginning of a seduction, and the man was reluctant to release his touch. The hull, constructed of heavy fiberglass, had no obvious soft spots, at least in the places Justin could reach. He smiled at the intact rudder and massaged his chin as he studied the broken mainmast, its upper quarter missing. Justin's eyes surveyed the top deck, his mind conceiving a plan in which sails were essential. A small hatch at the bow gave Justin hope. 2 large brass thumbscrews secured the hatch. Standing on the boat's railing and using a heavy stone, Justin hammered the corroded screws loose. When he tugged on the hatch, its hinges resisted, but Justin persisted, and with a groan the hatch opened. He placed a hand on either side of the opening and poked his head into the compartment. Slowly his eyes dilated, and like magic, sailbags materialized. "Beautiful," he whispered. With a loud whoop, he jumped from the bow railing and ran to the stern. "What's your name? Where are you from?" Nothing indicated her origin, but when he stepped farther away, the tattered remains of her name took shape. Justin spoke it loudly. "Christine." A smoldering excitement took flame. He clasped his hands in front of his chest. Destiny, an arrow pointing into the future. When the remainder of the traveling party caught up, they found Justin with his back to the hull and a broad grin on his face. Justin's thoughts returned to the present moment when the dinghy broached in low surf. He gave the left oar a few tugs, and the craft straightened. Moments later its bow dug into the beach with a grinding hiss. Justin jumped out and pulled the craft halfway onto the sand. Returning to the water's edge, he scooped a handful of seawater and drank it down. He took a deep breath, turned and trudged through the sand toward the vegetation line. He sat at the base of a large palm and wiggled, making the sand conform to his bottom. He pondered the sandy whites of the tropical beach and smiled at a whale spouting on the green sea. "Hi, big fella. You spending the day with us?" His chest swelled with a deep breath, and he closed his eyes. "I'm sure glad you guys made it." Moments later, with his eyes still closed, he whispered, "We're survivors, too." He smiled. "We survived. We survived." He opened his eyes to see the whale spout again. Now the land is different, and even the seas flow in a different way. His chest rose with another deep breath, and he held it for a long moment before driving it out with a huff. He did this 3 times and relaxed into stillness. Later, a breeze ruffled his hair, and his eyes opened to see the flukes of the whale as it slid into the deep. He got to his feet, took a few long strides, and began to jog down to the dinghy. Once there, he pushed the boat back into the sea, quickly found the oars, and commenced rowing parallel to the shore, searching for the freshwater stream. In less than a quarter of a mile, Justin beached the little craft again, and the refilling chore commenced. An hour later, after 2 trips to the Christine, Justin stood on the last container, watching the escaping bubbles. Suddenly, a bird screeched from the jungle. Justin winced at the cutting noise. He looked inland. Time for a little distraction, he thought. He stepped off the water can and sloshed upstream. At its mouth, the stream broadened and was only inches deep, but in the jungle it narrowed and deepened. The waters curled around Justin's knees. Large trees lined the stream, their bases hidden by bundles of brilliant foliage. Orchid-like flowers studded the greenery and perfumed the air. From a massive tree, a wide cascade of vines thickly covered with tiny violet flowers, hung to the water's edge and ceaselessly shed petals that drifted and swirled in a warm breeze. Small multicolored butterflies fluttered in the flowers, while large iridescent blue butterflies gathered on the stony patches at the water's edge. Large birds, bright blue and trailing long black feathers, swooped from high tree-tops. They screeched a protest at Justin and soared over the canopy. Flying close to the water, small yellow birds darted upstream, only to reappear moments later. The air reverberated with a constant cicada-like buzz. Tiny fish populated the stream. They darted with lightning speed, and when motionless, found invisibility with skin that matched the stream's bottom. Farther on the stream widened, and Justin swam across a small circular pool. A half-mile from the beach, Justin considered turning back. Then from his left, a pulse of light burst through the foliage. He backed up a step, and the flash glowed steadily. Glass or metal? He thought. Something man-made. He bit his lip. It's worth a look. He often found things of use in such places, the onboard cooking stove, for instance, and the water containers. He left the stream and pushed his way into the vegetation. At first he struggled, but once under the canopy, the plant life thinned, and he walked easily on sandy soil. Shortly, Justin found a small building of corrugated metal. Rusted red with many holes in it, it was a dreary sight in the vibrant jungle. The reflecting object, a solar cell, sat on the roof. Justin walked around the building with an inspecting eye. The door lay in the sand, a shadow of rust. A black rectangle in the building indicated its former place. Justin peered into the semi-darkness. At the center of the sandy floor, the ramshackle remains of a bed lay scattered. In a far corner, a pile of pots and pans and a broken chair was discernible. He looked to his left at the metal table. A radio receiver, a transmitter, and a telephone gave a hint as to the shack's purpose. Justin squinted at the shadow-clocked phone. Military, he thought. His eyes traced the path of wires from the phone that led outside. Probably to another building, but most likely far off. Another set of wires snaked through the sand to a half-buried battery and then climbed the wall. Those go to the solar cell. He paused and bit his lip, thinking the equipment could be of use at New Atlantis. He walked over to the battery and nonchalantly towed one of the terminal connectors. When the phone rang, Justin leaped backward, stumbled, and fell as the piercing sound echoed in the metal building, an unheard sound from long ago. His heart pounded, and his mind struggled with the implications. Shaking, he confronted the phone. Holy shit! Son of a bitch! He took a deep breath. That scared the crap out of me. He took another deep breath and smiled. A moment later he laughed. He leaned over the battery and studied it, hands on hips. Once more he nudged the terminal with his toe, and again the phone rang, and again he jumped, though this time under better control. Justin stood quietly and thought of Nicole. Slowly, a smile came to his face, and he slapped his right thigh and dropped to his knees. With both hands he dug a hole deep enough to contain the battery. He concealed its top with a thin layer of sand, and positioned a small stick above the loose terminal. He stood up and applied foot pressure to the stick. Inwardly braced, he pressed until the phone clamored. Justin still flinched. Laughing, he clapped his hands and ran to the stream. He swam almost all the way to the beach and the waiting water cans. Energetically, he loaded the cans and rowed back to the Christine. As he came alongside, he thumped the larger craft with an oar to notify Nicole of his return. Nicole, in the galley eating a piece of fruit, climbed topside and spoke a welcome. "Hi, what have you been up to?" She smiled. Justin delighted at the sound of her voice. "I'm topping off the water tanks." He suppressed a smile, but his eyes twinkled. "I found an old shack. There's some stuff inside that I'm sure we can use. Let's take a look later." He smiled. "After the fruit is gathered. It's a short walk upstream." Nicole lifted her eyebrows. "Okay, sounds good. But first, a bath." She tossed her fruit overboard, stepped to the side of the Christine, and paused before diving into the crystal-like blue water. Justin watched her flight, and then studied her distorted image beneath the surface. Nicole went deep, pulled a few hard strokes, and rose to the surface and swam toward the shore. Once there, she stepped from the sea and headed for the jungle stream. She looked back at the Christine. Justin poured water into the starboard tank. Her eyes diverted to the plume of a spouting whale. "Did you find something to eat?" She had watched the whale earlier. Nicole thought of the many whales seen during the voyage. She frowned. "I've seen a lot of you guys, but why only one at a time?" When Nicole arrived at the stream, she followed its bank to the vegetation line. There she removed her clothing and strode into the sweet water, its feel exceedingly soft compared to the harsh salinity of the ocean. After washing, she left the stream and allowed a warm breeze to dry her skin. Nicole slipped on her leather breeches and then laced her leather vest as she retraced her steps back to the beach. She looked toward the Christine, but there was no sign of Justin. She turned inland and headed for the jungle, her mind occupied with the task of picking fruit for the morning meal. When circumstances were right, she often got quite elaborate with the shore meals, a pleasant break from the makeshift situations at sea. Today, however, with other chores to accomplish, time was a factor. Nicole didn't have to venture deep into the brush to find a stomach-filling quantity of fruit and a few large leaves to separate fruit from sand. She arranged the meal beneath a palm tree. She again looked toward the Christine. This time Justin sat in the dinghy. He pushed off and rowed for shore, and she walked down to meet him. When the dinghy hit the sand, she held on to it as Justin climbed out. Together they pulled the craft ashore. Nicole grabbed Justin's hand and squeezed it. "Breakfast is ready. The usual ham and eggs, blueberry pancakes, fresh squeezed orange juice, etc., etc." Justin smiled. "I'm hungry enough to eat a monkey." He paused. "Did you see any monkeys by chance?" "I think we're the only monkeys here." Justin stared into the jungle. "There has to be a primate out there, somewhere." Nicole sighed. "I didn't see much animal life, other than birds. There's lots of fruit about. It'll be easy to get what we need." Together they unloaded the storage baskets and proceeded to where Nicole arranged the simple meal. Justin dropped the baskets. "Some of that fruit looks familiar." He scanned the leaf and pointed. "I really like those plum-looking things." He bent down and picked one up. "They need a name, though. Something with blue." Nicole sat in the sand and looked seaward. "They're not blue." She turned back to Justin. "I guess we can make another 3 to 4 day trip before coming ashore again." She looked to Justin for agreement. "Yeah, as long as the weather stays good and we catch a few fish on the way." He presented the plum-like fruit to her. "Are you sure these aren't blue?" And then he took a bite of it, and the escaping juice ran down his chin as he talked. "We've been lucky with the weather. A few squalls, some choppy seas." He spat out the tough skin of the fruit. "I wonder if there'll be hurricanes again." Minutes passed as they silently ate their meal. Justin tossed a pit in the direction of the ocean. "We have plenty of firewood, and the water tanks are topped off. We're ready for sea, mate. Time to cast off." And in a louder voice, It's time to head for home." Nicole jumped to her feet when the word home registered in her head. Previously, the references were to getting back or something like that. The word home charged her with sudden delight, and she smiled broadly. "First the fruit, and then we go, homeward bound." "Wait a minute. I almost forgot about the shack. We should do that. We have time." "The hell with it. Let's go." "No, no. There could be treasure, me hearty." Justin's light-hearted approach added the aspect of fun to the little adventure. "Okay, Blackbeard, but I get all the jewels. You can have the bullion." After gathering the fruit, they pushed the basket-laden dinghy back into the sea. Justin swam while Nicole rowed. On board the Christine, they left the fruit in the galley, proper stowage waiting until they returned from the little expedition. The couple moved upstream at a leisurely pace, looking at the flowers and watching the colorful butterflies. At the deep pool they lingered, enjoying the warm, clear water and the singing birds. Justin lazed, half submerged, his back resting on the shore, his eyes closed, and his torso basking in the sun. Nicole, more energetic, repeatedly swam to the upstream side of the pool and buoyantly reclined on the surface, allowing the slow current to carry her back. When a bird screeched, Justin opened his eyes just as Nicole floated by. Immediately his prank came to mind. From a sitting position he rolled forward and dove below the surface of the pool and reappeared at the upstream side. "Come on, let's get the treasure." "Aye, aye, Captain." Together they sloshed along, Justin in the lead, looking for the disturbed vegetation where he previously entered the jungle. In short time he found the spot and directed Nicole into the tangle. "You go first. It's only a short way." Nicole headed in, and Justin's hand went to his mouth. Nicole inquired, "How far do we have to go?" Justin mumbled, "What did you say?" No sooner said, the pair arrived at the shack. Nicole walked to the entrance, stepped inside, and looked about. Justin followed her silently. Nicole took note of everything, including the telephone and radio. However, her attention focused on the pile of things in the far corner. Her hands on her hips, she walked to the heap. "Looks like a pile of crap to me." Nonchalantly, Justin moved over to the stick lying in the sand. He looked down at his footprint from the previous visit, hesitated, and then smiled. He placed a foot on the stick. His eyes squinted. He bared his teeth and shifted his weight. Instantly the phone rang, loud and clear. Justin flinched. On the other side of the room it was sheer pandemonium. Nicole screamed and danced a little jig before stumbling into the pile of rubbish. Again the phone rang. Nicole lost her balance, lurched, and fell into the trash. Justin unmercifully rang the phone a third time. Nicole screeched in pain from the poking of numerous pot handles and the sight of spiders and bugs scurrying in the commotion. Justin rushed to the phone as Nicole regained her feet. "I'll get it." She stared wide-eyed as he passed by. Justin reached for the phone, stopped, and turned to Nicole. "Perhaps I shouldn't?" He shrugged his shoulders, turned away, and reached for the phone. Nicole, stunned, stood as she was, her mouth open, a pot in hand. Justin picked up the receiver. "Hello?" He waited as if listening and then mumbled something. He turned his back to Nicole and mumbled again. Justin sat the phone down and turned to Nicole, his face expressionless. "I think we want a trip to Las Vegas. They'll call back later." With squinting eyes, Nicole followed Justin as he turned and headed out of the shack. A moment later her jaw clenched and she raised the pot. "Craphead!" The pot flew through the door and hit Justin on the head. Justin started laughing as he rubbed his head. "I'm glad you didn't find an iron skillet." Nicole's shoulders suddenly slumped, and she leaned her head back. A puff of breath escaped her mouth, and she ambled into the light of day, her eyes bulging with tears. Justin's face sagged. He stepped towards her. Are you okay? It was a joke. I was hoping for a smile." Nicole raised a hand to stroke her forehead. "Oh, it's been a long time," she whispered. Her eyes drifted from Justin to the high tree canopy. "The world we lost?" She paused. "It all came back to me in a rush." She blinked. "That fear you get?" "I was afraid." "Why should I be afraid? I don't think I was afraid when I lost it." She shivered. Justin led her to a fallen tree. Nicole sat, her elbows on her knees, her head bowed. Justin leaned in to see her face. "I'm so sorry. I thought it would make you laugh." Nicole raised her head and took a deep breath. "I'm okay." She gave him a peck on the lips. "I'm okay." She took another deep breath, straightened her back, braced herself with her hands on her knees, and stared into the brush. A time warp. She paused. The old world. She bowed her head. "I felt it. I felt it the same as I felt it then." She looked at Justin. "I loved it. I lost it. And then I was afraid, all in that short moment." She smiled. "How did you do that? Make the phone ring?" Justin explained in a few short sentences and finished with a sigh. "It was meant to be fun." "Oh, it was really quite clever." She smiled and gave him another kiss. "I'm sure I'll laugh about it. Later." Nicole rose to her feet. "Let's get back." She shoved him toward the stream. "Justin, do you miss it? All that technology, all the people, and now being almost alone on the planet?" Justin didn't look at her. "Yeah, I think I do." He turned to face her. "We're an endangered species, you know." They headed back to the beach. "I think you aged me a good 10 years, craphead." She shoved him again. Later that day, Justin, alone, towed the dinghy upstream and retrieved the phone equipment, the solar cell, and the aluminum pot. Chapter 2. Troubling Seas and Thoughts to Flee. Justin. In the northwest corner of America, in the state of Oregon, where the land meets the sea, rugged cliffs rose to ridges where twisted pine crouched to the pressure of onshore winds. At the base of the stony walls, cold blue-green waters alternated between pounding and caressing. To the north and south of the walls, stretches of white sand heaped into huge granular waves assail and abate in slow movement, harassing legions of tall pines. Midpoint on the coast, where the Umpqua River flowed into the Pacific Sea, the tiny harbor of Winchester Bay huddled. Protected on 3 sides by low forested hills, it faced the western sea. Here, fishing people made their home, alongside a few loggers and those who catered to seasonal visitors. One of those fishermen, Justin, lived with his daughter, Michelle, and his 2 sons, Paul and David. The wife and mother of the family died years earlier in Virginia, a victim of cancer. Soon after her death, Justin moved with his children to California, briefly staying with his sister and her family. He made an exploratory trip to Oregon and found the small hamlet of Winchester Bay. falling in love with the town, he moved his family there and built a new life. With determined effort, the group achieved a substantial livelihood through commercial fishing and the wise investment of surplus money. After Justin's retirement, Paul, the oldest son, captained Justin's fishing vessel, Orca. The 52-foot stern trawler functioned primarily for shrimping and occasionally for crabbing. Justin seldom went to sea anymore, but when he did, it was usually during the migration of the gray whales. In early spring, with the whales headed north for a summer of gorging, the Orca rode the steep and choppy waves at the mouth of the river. Justin stood at the helm, with Paul to his right. Paul, in his early 20s, with a strong body, stood nearly the same height as his father. His blue eyes studied the weather on the western horizon. Like his father, he had a prominent nose, but a softer jawline. His shoulder-length hair protruded from a watch cap. The Orca's helm required a strong hand and near constant movement as the craft struggled in the channel chop. The sky, light blue, waited for the sun to peek over the eastern hills. The men planned a short day, pulling a few crab pots and watching for whales. A confusion of waves at the river mouth gripped the Orca and jerked her about, only to release her a moment later. Justin held the boat's heading firmly to west and seaward toward deeper ocean water, where the seas rolled large and smooth and would soothe the Orca's motion. Paul looked north. "There was a pot or two up north yesterday." He turned to his father. "That's where the pots are that I didn't get." Justin nudged the engine throttles to increase speed. "What made you turn back with just a few pots to pull?" "It was getting sloppy." Paul braced himself as the Orca lurched to starboard. "There wasn't much crab in the other pots, and I knew we'd be coming out today." Justin handled the helm with obvious pleasure. His first trip of the year, his blue eyes sparkled under bushy eyebrows. "As soon as we're out of this chop, I'll swing her north." He looked at his son and pushed his watch cap to the back of his head. "How far north and how deep?" "A couple of miles, 30 fathoms. A few minutes later Justin shifted the helm to starboard, beginning a slow swing to the north. Justin looked at Paul as the boat's motion calmed. "Time for a cup of coffee." Without a word, Paul went aft to the galley. He hollered, "Want an egg sandwich?" "Just coffee." Having coffee after crossing the bar was almost a ritual for the father and son. The first time, a salmon trip, Paul was 12 and on his first trip as a deckhand. Justin again controlled the helm, but had turned it over to Paul after crossing the bar. They spent 3 days and 2 nights at sea in a venture special to both. On this trip, Justin would not transfer the helm. Paul, who had given his 2-man crew the day off, functioned as the deckhand. Paul returned to the wheelhouse and handed a cup to his father. Justin put it to his lips and watched the ponderous swells roll out of the west. "If you need some time off later, let me know. It'll be my pleasure." He smiled, put his coffee cup in the holder, and with the same hand switched the sonar machine from reading feet to reading fathoms. Justin turned toward his son. "I was looking at the books the other day. It's shaping up to be a good season." "Yeah, with the good weather, I got an extra 20 days of fishing in." Justin took another sip of coffee. "It's a lot different than when I started fishing here." He leaned over the helm for a close study of the compass. "The storms are fewer." He turned to Paul and squinted. "But more intense." The compass reached due north, and Justin swung the rudder to port to check the starboard swing. He held it there for a moment, and then positioned it amidship. "I think we're getting the weather they used to get in southern Oregon." Paul took another bite of his sandwich and mumbled his words. "The patterns have shifted north. I talked to Steve in Alaska. He says that things are kind of that way up there, too." Justin looked at Paul. "How's he doing?" Not too good. He's coming back. He asked me for a job. Paul slid the side window open and tossed the remainder of his egg sandwich over the side. Things are messed up. The water's warm, and then the water's cold. When it rains, it pours. Justin let out a slow breath. The rhythm's gone. Paul pulled his hat off and scratched his head. I try to push all that shit out of my head. He sighed. But I can't. It's in front of my face all the time. He slid the side window shut with a loud thump and turned to his father. We've pulled a lot of deformed crabs out of the pots this year. Hell, the deckies don't even bother mentioning them anymore. The Orca crested a huge swell, and Justin turned to the next one coming. Shit! The carcass of a gray whale crested the top of the oncoming wave as it drifted toward shore. Justin instantly pushed the boat's throttle forward. Both men watched as the whale disappeared over the top of the swell, its flipper rising into the air as the body rolled with the motion of the wave. Macabre, it seemed a farewell gesture. Paul lowered his head and looked the other way. Yeah, that too. I haven't said anything to you about it, but it's not so uncommon. Justin spoke softly and slowly. What a mess. What to do? Paul's expression shadowed. There's nothing to do. There's just too many people, Dad. Too many damn people. Paul turned toward his father, his face twisted with disgust. Everybody wants, but who volunteers to do with less? Justin bit his lip at his son's sudden show of anger and studied the approach of another swell. Of late, climate change and the degeneration of the environment were common subjects wherever you went. Apprehension undercut even the daily small talk. A warm day in winter was suspect. An earthquake or a volcanic eruption echoed as an omen. A little war here and a little war there projected an overall attitude. Quiet, sullen moments passed. Justin's anticipated joyous day at sea clouded with Paul's demeanor and the harbinger of the dead whale. He turned and spoke sternly to his son. We don't have to surrender to it. His eyes drifted to the horizon above the bow of the Orca. But we can't fight it. We can only keep our eyes open, go with the flow of the surge. More quiet moments passed. Abruptly, Paul hoisted his cup. Well, here's to open eyes and going with the surge. The men sipped their coffee in silence as ponderous seas rolled beneath the Orca and the hefty diesel engine throbbed. Later, after the men pulled up the last crab pot, the Orca dashed back to port just before the winds of noon. Justin sat in a soft recliner on the back deck of his home, his eyes squinted at a glittering sea under the late afternoon sun of a midsummer day. His home, built from Douglas fir logs, sat high on a hill, presenting a view of the Pacific Ocean, the Umpqua River, and Winchester Bay. The view did not relieve his agitation. Moments before, he silenced the TV after learning of a new form of antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis. He spoke with anger. Keeping that depressing stuff away is like shoveling shit against the tide. The doorbell rang, and he heard a familiar voice. "Justin!" He smiled. "On my way, Zoe." Zoe was a New York City transplant from almost 4 years ago. She was close to Justin in age, but never specified in exactness. A dark-haired, dark-eyed beauty, her Mediterranean genes were obvious. Justin met her at a Blessing of the Fleet festival. In the late hours of the beer garden dance, and at the prodding of his friends, he asked her to dance. An unknown entity at the time, she projected mystery with her beauty and big city style. That night a hot relationship ignited between Justin and Zoe, but it cooled quickly to a comfortable warm. Her perfume swirled in the folds of a cool breeze that meandered through Justin's rustic living room into the adjoining dining room and out the French doors to the covered deck where Justin stood in its flow. Its clean yet exotic bouquet provoked waves of eagerness in Justin. Zoe stood in the light of the open door. A full-bodied woman, she wore jeans that were not tight, just tight enough. A light yellow windbreaker protected her from the ever-cool and windy Oregon coast. She wore primitive-looking sandals, her toenails painted a crisp red. Justin watched her ample lips spread into a pleasant smile. "I came to town to get a few things. I thought you might have time to take a lonely gal to dinner." Justin, joyed by her surprise visit, walked quickly to her and gripped her by the waist with both hands. He planted a sumptuous kiss on her neck. She stomped her right foot on the floor. "I love that." Her brow knitted. "But I hate it as well." She stepped back from him. "I'll take that as a yes to dinner?" "Oh, it's a yes, all right. And please, stay the night." She smiled. "Let's go to my place. I've prepared potions of chocolate." Justin only had a general idea of her background. Her first career was as an actress in the New York theater, and she did well, but not great. In her early 30s she changed careers with the help of a friend to some sort of Wall Street situation and made a lot of money. She never married, had no children, and as she put it, Oregon keeps the family at bay. Justin moaned. "Chocolate." He took another breath of her perfume and spoke softly. "Yes, yes, yes." He stepped backward to contain his urges. "Is the hot tub hot?" "With my intuitive anticipation, yes." She pouted a kiss. Justin took her by the hand. "It's a bit early for dinner. Let's have a glass of wine." With familiarity they moved toward the table in the dining room. The table consisted of large, heavy, unfinished planks retrieved from the beach after a winter storm. It now functioned as the gathering place for all who came to Justin's home. Unmatched chairs surrounded the table, stuffed with high backs, very comfortable and not at all formal. Zoe sat in her favorite, an old Mediterranean type with carved mystical animals and soft leather upholstery. Justin went to the kitchen for the wine, a cream sherry. He found an ashtray and joined Zoe. He sat across from her in David's chair. Its wood was simple oak and the upholstery overstuffed blue denim. It leaned backward like an office chair. Justin poured the wine, sat back in his chair, and took a deep drink. "You have lightened my day. I've been brooding." Zoe rummaged through her bag and pulled out a small wooden pipe. "A little of this will be nice before dinner." She laid it on the table. Her hand went back into the purse, but she suddenly stopped and looked up. "Brooding? Don't tell me." She stilled, leaned forward, and looked deep into his eyes. "I see fear." She paused. "Also indecision." She leaned back, her attention returned to the purse. "Ah, here it is." She pulled out a silver and gold pill box. Justin raised his eyebrows. "You can read eyes?" He smiled. "And you're right. What's the source of that talent?" Zoe filled the pipe with a pinch of pot and handed it to Justin. "Oh, it relates to dramatics, drama school. It can be learned to some degree." She paused. "A must if you're going to teach acting." "I didn't know that you taught." Zoe relaxed back into her chair. "Now and then, between theater engagements, at Columbia and a few times at Juilliard." Justin's eyes lit up. "That picture at your house, the group shot." "Yes, my last and best class." She looked beyond Justin at the view of the ocean. There were two special talents in that group. She paused and her eyes drifted back to Justin. "They both died. And let's not talk about that." Justin instantly granted her wish. Zoe lived in a cozy house overlooking the same river that flowed past Justin's place. Her only companions were a couple of dogs and a cat. Zoe came to Oregon seeking isolation to pen a book. To her surprise, the isolation became comfortable. Justin took the pipe and struck a wooden match. Zoe watched. "What's causing you to brood, Justin?" Justin positioned the match carefully and drew in a breath. A moment later he blew out the breath and the match. "The world, the mess, and the seemingly no-way-out scenario." She took the pipe. "And of course there are your children." Justin sat back. "What about you? Do you worry? Are you making plans?" "Oh, I'm cognizant as to what's going on." She struck a match and lit the pipe. A moment later the smoke streamed in a thin line between her pouted lips. "The book is nearly finished. I'll be taking it back to New York." Her eyes shifted back to Justin. "I'm going to keep the house. I love that place." She paused and rearranged herself in the chair. "In short, Justin, life as usual." She picked up her glass of wine and took a sip. "Nice." Justin loved her self-assuredness. Unlike some women, it was inoffensive and authentic, not some sort of proclamation or ultimatum. "World stability has a skin about as thick as a soap bubble." Zoe's face shadowed. "And I prefer it pop while I'm in New York." Justin drank more of the wine. "Well, it's going to be ugly." Zoe took a deep breath. "Listen to your gut, Justin. It's what I do. We have our destinies, and our guts show us the way." She paused. "Relax. Allow the thoughts to come." Justin flopped back in his chair. "You're right. Let the revelations come. I will think with my gut." He smiled. "And right now it tells me eating time is near." Zoe smiled back. "I'm really in the mood for seafood. Crab, salmon, oysters. Where should we go?" "The Crabby Wench, of course." They stood and headed for the door. One winter day, Justin walked the beach just south of Winchester Bay. The sun brightened the cold air as it moved from sea to shore. Huge chunks of trees, some simple in shape, most true sculpture, decorated the beach. Washed ashore by winter storms, their visit lasted only to mid-spring. Justin never understood how most found their way back to the sea. He looked to the southwest. A dark wall of clouds pushed shoreward beneath a lid of thin gray clouds. Another storm on its way. Large drops of wind-driven rain would soon be pelting his form. He always found that acceptable, and even welcoming. Justin walked the wet sand behind a still receding tide, his interest on a large root wad less than a quarter of a mile away. It arrived on the beach only hours ago. Justin pressed his weight into the southerly wind and headed for the carcass of wood. When he arrived, he pushed in the lee of the stump and for a moment studied its shape. Eventually he raised a hand and rubbed a smooth segment. The thrashing sea scrubbed the wad clean of all small roots and most of its bark. At its base, a shallow pool shimmered in the gusty wind. Justin reached into the sea puddle and grabbed a cockle-shell. Being careful not to spill its contents, he raised it to his mouth and poured the liquid in. One of Justin's shore-walk rituals. As he put it, a bit of the sea within. As the sea-water ran down his throat, Zoe came to mind. He was close to loving her, but knew better. Instinctively, he knew that if he made a step in that direction, she would instantly cut him loose, like the swipe of a samurai blade. Zoe had a hidden agenda. Justin smiled. He knew that some said he was being used. Perhaps, and perhaps not. In any case, she did it in a nice way. He looked at the huge storm-driven waves, icy green with a frothy white across their chaotic tops. Zoe had disappeared into another life. It's been months since I've heard from her. An exceptionally strong gust of wind rushed past the huge root wad. Justin stepped into the open and turned south. The thoughts of Zoe fluttered away, and his conversation with Paul fluttered in. Flow with the surge, he thought. Justin came to a sudden stop. His body froze as if poised before a precipice. He shouted into the wind, "Take control of your life. What crap." He stepped forward, resuming his walk. Think with your gut. Justin mused. Birth, one step leads to another, cause and effect. You must have control at the beginning, or you never have control. Given genes, subjected to environment, now here. He closed his eyes and walked blindly. 6 billion people doing what they want. He stopped again and opened his eyes. I don't think so. Again he walked. The control is somewhere else, and the effort is not for me or for us. A seagull, troubled with the man's approach, took 2 gawky steps with spread wings and rose into the air. Gracefully it veered west and then north, but quickly grounded after establishing satisfactory distance. Well, excuse me. Justin followed the flight of the bird and walked backwards as he waved a goodbye and turned south once more. His mind resumed its philosophical flow. Separateness is an illusion created by the powers that be. He lowered his head to the contemplation of being one with the seagull. Neither of us is perfect, and if we are one with the one, then the one isn't perfect. He spun his back to the wind and stopped. I'm being used. He looked at the seagull. We're all being used. My life and yours, he pointed at the seagull, are being used to achieve their perfection. Justin turned back to face the wind. He spread his arms out and looked down. The remnants of a wave washed close to his feet and ebbed back to sea. Struck by the sudden urge to be near the action, he lowered his arms and followed the wave at a trot. The flat subsiding water slid under the next incoming wave, causing it to break and join its rush back to sea. Cold water seeped into Justin's walking shoes as he ambled through the slushy sand. Abruptly, a burly wave swelled in front of him, green and strong. Justin took another step, halted, and took a step backward. The wave paused and then rushed at him. He turned and ran. Peripherally, he saw the wave catching up, forcing him to sprint. He reached dry sand and spun around, watching his challenger retreat. He smiled. Sorry, my drowning wasn't meant to be. I'm not finished being used. Justin stood quietly and surveyed the turbulent sea far beyond the breaking waves. He sucked in a breath and savored the moist air. Salt air. His mind cleared and rested. He stood that way for close to 20 minutes. A single large drop of rain struck Justin on the left side of his neck and ran beneath his clothing. Instantly, he turned north, back to the truck. As he walked, he pulled the hood of his jacket over his head. An instantaneous hush occurred when the heavy fabric covered his ears. Justin anticipated the effect, and the now silent wind pushed at his back and levitated his steps. I'm not responsible, he smiled, and I haven't anything better to do anyway. Justin, light of heart, followed his past footprints back to where they climbed the small beach dune leading to the parking lot. The large globules of rain pelted his back with increased intensity, though they felt more like pats. He thought it would be foolish not to prepare. Justin drove up the small private road he shared with 2 other neighbors. His house was large, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths. Old cedar trees screened its eastern side. A comfortable home, warm and secure for his family. It would be difficult to leave, a trepidation Justin already wrestled with. He parked the truck and walked into the house. "Is anybody here?" A response came from one of the back rooms. "Yeah, I'm here, in my room." It was David. David was 18 and just out of high school, a bright boy and a sure candidate for college. These days he made periodic fishing trips with Paul, earning pocket money. He planned to take a year or two off for what he called fooling around before going to college. A computer whiz, he did a lot of reading and sometimes talked about writing. Justin didn't mind the schooling delay. David was mature beyond his age, and Justin trusted his decisions. Justin spoke loudly. "Did you check with Paul? I think he had some work for you." Justin heard the boy's footsteps coming down the hall. "No, but I will. Can I use the truck, Dad?" He stopped at the end of the hallway and faced his father. Justin looked at his son's long hair. Wavy, brown, and shoulder-length, it enhanced his angular face, giving him an intellectual look. "Sure, the keys are in it." Justin watched him turn and head for the door. His somewhat frail body moved with grace, but not strength. Running around in the wild could be difficult for him. "Be home for dinner, and if you see Michelle, tell her the same." David spun around, his brown eyes squinting. "Something's up." "What?" David possessed a special insight that always caught Justin off guard. Justin hesitated. "I've made a decision, and I want to tell you all at the same time." David studied his father for a long moment before turning for the door again. "I always have faith in what you do, Dad." He twisted the door handle and spoke over his shoulder. "Michelle's working at the cafe. I'll stop by and tell her." He opened the door, stepped through, and closed it. Justin stared at the closed door and mused. David would be good at the navigational skills needed in the woods. Gather maps, find places to hide supplies, and how to get back to them. Michelle, the middle child, close to 20 years old, worked part-time for Paul as well, taking care of the books and sometimes waiting on tables at the Crabby Wench. She was saving money for college and planned to attend the University of Oregon when, as she put it, "I'm absolutely sure what I want to be." Michelle, like Paul, a former high school athlete, possessed a strong body. Justin mused again. Putting the foodstuff together. Information on edible wild plants. I'll give her some help. There's also the medical supplies and how to use them. His thoughts switched to Paul. Weapons, shelter, hunting techniques. Justin pushed his plate away and took a sip of wine. "There's a serious subject I want to talk about." He rubbed his chin. "It's about the mess the world is in, and how to deal with it." His children were quick to voice opinions. Michelle spoke with anger about the struggling environment and overpopulation. Paul cited examples of society's decreasing ability to maintain order and scoffed at the police-state rules that only increased the chaos. David's contribution related to the terror tactics popping up everywhere, and he saw no meaningful leadership from any quarter. Justin stopped the conversation. Okay, we all know that shit." He bit his lip. "What counts is how we deal with it." A few moments of quiet ensued. Justin leaned toward the table. "I have a plan. I'll state it to the point without details." The children waited. Justin bit his lip and took a breath. "Well, most likely we'll end up living in the woods, moving from place to place." He looked at his children. Paul wore a slight smile. Michelle's eyes widened. David sat expressionless, almost relaxed. Justin continued, "Living off of the land and hidden supplies." He took another sip of wine. The smile on Paul's face grew to a grin. "So you really want to do this?" He slapped the table. "We're going to live in the woods." Justin held up one hand. This is preparation. We're not heading out the door in the next few weeks. The preparations will take months, and hopefully won't be needed." Michelle looked directly at her father with a serious expression. "Dad, tell me this is a joke." Justin made no comment. He just stared back at her. Michelle's face calmed, and she leaned back in her chair. "Count me out. I'm not living in the woods." She ran her fingers through her long, light brown hair. David toyed with the scraps of food on his plate. Michelle spoke again. "We can't just run off and start living in the woods. That's crazy." She had her father's blue eyes, and they darkened with each passing moment. "We can pile things up here." David responded. "He said that we should prepare, and that we might wind up in the woods." Michelle smirked. "My little brother, our father has done peculiar things before." Paul leaned forward. "Okay. The world is a mess. We can all see that." He sat up straight. "Preparation, no big deal. Money in the bank." He relaxed back into his chair. Michelle slapped the table with both hands. "Wait a minute. Wait a minute." She looked at her father. "This talk is scary. Are things getting that bad?" Justin frowned. "Scary is a good description." Paul smirked. "Fucked up is another." Michelle placed her elbows on the table, her face resting in her hands. Justin knew her plans for the future, love, marriage, career, etc. But what could he do? Paul's eyes were bright. Justin mused to himself silently. "Paul will do just fine. The action, the adventure, it'll stimulate his blood." Justin turned to David. "What do you think, son?" David studied the table before him. "Living in the woods will be hard and dangerous." Justin swallowed and cleared his throat. "We'll do some training, build up our endurance." Paul spoke up. "Are we going to put up some kind of a house or a shelter?" Justin sat back in his chair. "The plan is to be independent. We move a lot. We stay for only short periods of time at any given spot. We don't want to be put in a position of defending a place. There's no way of telling which place will be safe or for how long. We'll have buried supplies. We'll live off the land as much as possible." He paused. "Eventually things will calm down and order will return. It's the in-between time that we need to worry about." All three of his children fell silent. They did not look at one another. After a few moments, Michelle pushed her chair away from the table, picked up her plate and tableware, and walked slowly into the kitchen. David still toyed with the food scraps on his plate. Paul leaned back in his chair, his hands behind his head. He stared into space. Justin broke the silence. "Let's clean up the dishes. This plan needs to cook a while." As the boys rose to a standing position, Justin added a closing statement. "One important thing to remember. Our plans are to remain a closed family matter. No one else is to know. It'll be difficult enough to save ourselves." He drank down his last sip of wine. "We'll talk again on Tuesday."